Um, the agenda today, I'm going to set the scene with a very quick introduction, and then I'm going to hand over to Pete and Anne for their presentations. After that, Gai Le Roy is going to lead a Q&A session with Pete and Anne. So just to kick off with some background to our presentation today. News consumption has understandably changed over the last few months. People have been really hungry for information, and they've been returning to news sites frequently for updates. You can see here that engagement with news sites peaked on the 22nd of March as Australians entered that lockdown and travel restriction period in that following week. Total time spent on news websites was up 88% during that week, compared to the pre-COVID period in February. That intense period of news consumption has eased slightly. However, there is heightened activity still at the moment on news sites compared to pre-COVID times. And there are spikes in engagement, as you can see, on particular days, as particular days drive those spikes in engagement, and we expect that to continue. Back in the beginning of April, the IAB fielded our first digital ad impact study with advertisers and agencies to understand their intentions on investments in advertising over the coming months. We found that 21% of the advertisers and agencies that we surveyed had paused all of their activity, and a further 57% had decreased their expenditure at that time. Some were completely withdrawing that spend, some were delaying, and a high proportion there really not sure of their plans as yet. But they were definitely, monitoring that situation very closely. The IAB are about to go in field with the second wave of this survey to assess how things have changed. We definitely appreciate all support that we could get from advertisers and agencies in completing this new survey to provide the industry as robust data as we possibly can. The IAB in the US have completed 2 waves of a very similar ad impact study in their market amongst advertisers and agencies. And they found that news publishers were suffering most from pauses and cancellations in advertising activity over the period from March to June. News publishers were also reporting that they were twice as likely to have ads blacklisted because of COVID-19 content. Similarly, with Australian publishers, they were reporting to the IAB that many advertisers had mistakenly updated their programmatic and other media buying to prevent advertising surrounded by keyword topics like crisis and coronavirus and COVID-19. The IAB have been concerned that there's a missed opportunity there where advertisers have inadvertently blocked quality content sites that were having such highly engaged audiences at the moment. We know that good marketers want to support news and journalism, and they know how important advertising support is to the sustainable production of news content. We know that having advertising messages in these environments with engaged audiences may require a modification to creative assets so that your advertising, still has the relevant message and tone at this time. The US study here shows that, for advertisers within news content, they are more likely to be modifying those creative assets to be able to get back in. With this context in mind, the IAB wanted to provide confidence to marketers to continue to support news publishers through this COVID-19 period and beyond. Sharing this challenge with Pete at Neuro-Insight. Neuro-Insight have leveraged their large body of research and they have conducted a special study for the IAB to understand the contextual influence of news websites on advertising during this period. And Pete's also got some tips on how marketers can unlock the context benefits of news environments at this time. I'm going to hand over to Pete now. Please bear with us while we just swap screens and Pete takes over the presentation, and we'll continue from there with some amazing Neuro-Insight research.
Thank you, Nat. Is that visually and audibly coming through nice and clear?
Yes.
Great. Okay. Well, look, thank you to everyone that's joined us today. It's a delight indeed to be sharing this with so many people. So thanks for giving up your time, and we want to make it well worth your while. Also, thanks to the team at IAB for collaborating with us so quickly on a really important issue. So there's a fair bit to cover. I'm sure the Neuro-Insight teams and the IAB teams will be here beyond today to follow up with any other queries or questions you may have beyond Q&A today. So a bit about neuroscience and what we've been up to the last sort of 15, 16 years. Really what we're all about is working with advertisers to optimize creative and media companies to optimize the opportunities for their advertisers in media. And a very strong theme that will come through today is more and more we're working with advertisers and media on that 360 view, actually bringing creative, messaging and media together. And you know, this is one of my all-time favorite topics, media context and how it works. And a lot of context is just so hard to consciously and rationally articulate. We would say it's almost invisible. We know it's there, we know it works, but how can you capture it, define it, and measure it is what we're about to share with you. And in doing that, using neuroscience to optimize creative and media, one of all the measures that we pick up from a neuro point of view, the one measure that's the most important is long-term memory encoding. That is linked to advertising effectiveness. And from an advertising point of view, if your ad's going to work, then it must get into long-term memory to even have a chance of working. That's an incredibly important construct, and that is that over the years we've peer-reviewed and published extensively that link between long-term memory encoding and ad effectiveness or in-market behaviour, which is what we're all looking for these days, much, much more than we probably ever have. And that correlation, working with clients specifically with their econometric modelling data, has seen us come up with an 86% correlation with in-market effects and our neuro data. So that's an important underpinning. I guess notwithstanding that's a high number, we always look to optimize the upside. And again, the upside's invisible until you can see it. And you've probably heard a lot more talk these days about thinking fast, thinking slow, system 1, system 2. So system 2 is the slower, more rational, conscious type of processing, the things that surveys and maybe focus groups would pick up on. And then there's just a lot lurking below the waterline there in system 1. The fast, intuitive, things that we can't consciously articulate is what neuro and implicit, another methodology we use, taps into. And that's where we start to see the invisible effects of media, creative, and how they work together. All the metrics that we're going to look at today are pretty much channel agnostic, which is an important construct. The rules of play tend to be the same, but looking at TV, radio, print, out of home, and digital, and actually mediums beyond that, context is alive and well in all those mediums. And what we want to do is share and draw on some of our learnings from the past, say, 15 years or so, that actually give you some context as to why we've come up with what we have today. If you look way back at say, the TV context environment, this is where we started to first see some heavy lifting from a program environment into an ad break. Now, if you look at, you know, we've all heard of the left brain and the right brain. If you look at the left brain is called detailed on that top left graphic. The right brain is called global. And what we found is that a TV program environment would actually set what we call a neurostate bias, the balance between the left and right brain processing. And lo and behold, you can actually put a number on that, either a positive or a negative number. And that same number tended to translate into the neurostate of an ad break. So essentially, a very, very strong R squared there, anyone into their stats. The relationship between the program's influence on an ad break is huge. And this was our first insight to really unlock, the power of context. And there's many ways that you can look at and define context. This was the first big one, which we went on to, but it's a very, very important underpinning to the rule that we're going to be using later on. Coming out of the GFC in the US, our friends at Bravo and Chrysler actually found this working very well. So that's what we call time series, second by second time series data on a 90-second Chrysler TVC. And what we found, that solid orange line versus the dotted orange line was where the solid line was actually mapped to an appropriate and a fitting neurostate. So what we found is that when the neurostate of the ad, the creative, matched that of the TV environment, you'd get about 25% uplift in your effectiveness. So there you can see that solid line performing about 25% higher than the dotted line, simply as a function of the ad leveraging the power of the context in that environment. Another study more recently that was done in the UK with Newsworks, October 2018, looked at the comparison between the effectiveness of advertising in a hard news environment versus a soft news environment. Overall, looking at all our measures on that radar plot, the important measures of memory at 10 o'clock and 2 o'clock there, about the same. But on average, the response to soft news was the same as hard news on average across the whole experience of a newsreader. However, we found that hard news was actually, arguably what you'd define as COVID-19 centric news these days, elicited higher peaks and stronger peaks. So advertising in that environment would take advantage of much, much stronger peaks, to the point where we could map on a plot here, looking at the brain activity, the higher, warmer colors on the right, which is the advertising in hard news, versus advertising on the left in soft news. We found that had a lot more brain activity in simply being in a hard news environment, taking advantage of those peaks, again, about 20 to 25% increase in effectiveness there. So that's about the neuroscience of how memories are stored. And again, an ad must get into long-term memory if it's got any hope of working. But here's part two of that story. If an ad or a message gets into long-term memory, it doesn't just swim around there in isolation. What it does is it links to a network of associations. Associations that we as consumers have become familiar with over the years, like "Oh, what a feeling," colors, jingles, brands themselves, logos, those type of things, once they're well worn, become part of a network of associations. And this is where media context takes center stage. It's because media context can change and color and add meaning to the message on the way in. And that's what we're about to unlock in this next chapter here. What do we mean by a network of associations? Well, if we were to think of Steve Jobs, we'd immediately probably think of Apple, the iPhone, and so forth. But there's, of course, an extensive network of associations when you think of Steve Jobs, Apple, and iPhone. And some of those links are weak, some of them are very strong. And our methodology actually looks to quantify the association strength. And it's that strength which helps us understand the fabric of a media environment. So science can indeed measure, quantify, and therefore hand the power to advertisers and media companies to unlock and to actually leverage the power of this context. I'll explain how we actually measure a media fabric and a media context in a few moments' time. But suffice to say, a few years ago, here's a great example of house rules. Coming up anywhere beyond that in a dotted line of 120, is a strong attribute. So we're looking at, say, 4 strong attributes for house rules here: future, creative, Australian, and family. Now, the one that we've called out here is family, a very, very strong attribute within the house rules environment. So that's part 1, actually measuring the fabric, the colour, and the meaning of a media environment. If I was you right now, I'd be saying, well, so what? How do I leverage this? Just because you can measure it in a media environment, so what? And this is the clincher. This is part 2, and this is how we've uncovered how an advertising context, a media context, shares its equity with an advertiser. And this is the clinching point of the story. So we've established that house rules has a strong family attribute. What you're looking at there is the time series data, the 2 sort of squiggly lines, if you like. There's a solid red line and a dotted red line. So we have a double-sized sample, and we segment the audience who have watched that ad in context, in an ad break, in house rules, by those who have grown the most on family for the ad, and those who have grown the least on family. And what we've found here, in short, is that there's a very, very strong transfer of that family attribute coming out of house rules and into the ad, where we've looked at moments that are responsible for the product and branding delivery, and then key scenes further on in the ad, which integrated family scenes and had a lot of native branding. The solid line is significantly stronger than the dotted line. That tells us that that's conclusive scientific proof that there's been a shared equity. That ad has benefited from the growth in family. If it hadn't, the solid line and the dotted line would be tracking about the same. So that's allowed us to establish some rules of play as to A, how we define the fabric of an environment, and B, how we can now be confident that the fabric and the colour and the meaning of that environment transfers to the advertiser. And this, we believe, is really unique and very, very powerful in terms of informing an advertiser on how to get amongst a program or any media environment. With respect to the IAB study that we did, the IAB selected a basket of 6 attributes. There you see them there: connected, informative, quality news, publicly spirited, trustworthy, and timely. That we were interested to explore the strength of those attributes in a couple of top 10 news online environments that were covering COVID-19 news. So what we went about, and this is where I'll explain the methodology of implicit, which is the blend of neuro and implicit, based on about 200 projects around the world, 1.5 million data points now. It's basically our proprietary associative priming task. Basically, what this allows us to do is to look at the reaction time speed of under 500 milliseconds, which is subconscious, and it's delivered on a connected device. So fairly easy to distribute, fairly easy to recruit to people who are online news consumers in this case, and look at that pure subconscious response to an attribute of really any media environment, or for that matter, quantify any 2 associations. The normal scale, 80 to 160, and as you can see between the dotted lines, a weak attribute comes in at 100, a very strong attribute comes in at 140, and 99.9% of any attribution will lie between 100 and 140, the average being 120. What is worth looking at is a few famous associations in the marketing and media world that we've in Australia all become familiar with. You look at Toyota and AFL, a very, very long-term multi-million-dollar association there, coming in at way above the strong at 160. So a very, very familiar, strongly associated link there. The association between ANZ and the Australian Open, again at 170, incredibly strong, and probably an association that doesn't require a subconscious measure, Santa and Christmas. An incredibly strong, probably the strongest association that you could think of off the top of your head. Now, of course, they're outliers, but that's what the methodology has been validated to provide. Most, again, between 100 to 140. So looking at the rules of play, what we've now found, looking at all of the global work that we've done over the years, is that this database has told us that when a media environment has an attribute of a certain strength, it's much, much more likely to share that equity with an advertiser within that environment. And that key number is about 130. So it's the upper quartile, if you like, of that range. When an attribute of a media environment comes in and weighs in at 130 plus, it's much, much more likely. You can be very confident that that will be shared with advertisers. And this is the really important thing. It's all well and good to measure an attribute, but to prove that it's transferred to you as an advertiser or a media buyer is profoundly important. So looking at the design here, 920 respondents, as Nat Stanbury said last week. This is not quite a week old yet, April 27 to 30. We've turned it into a set of insights which we're sharing with you today. And basically, what we're going to share with you is the difference in the same online news environment with respect to comparisons between hard news, related news, and lifestyle news, and what that means to an advertiser essentially. So if we're looking at examples of hard news, we're looking at facts, figures, unfortunate death rates, and the fairly confronting side of COVID-19. What you'd call hard, similar to the UK study done a couple of years ago when we're looking at hard news. And what we found there, looking at that outer dotted line of 140, is that of all those 6 attributes, timely was the one strong attribute of a hard news environment. So what would this mean to an advertiser? Well, anything that had a sense of urgency, a very, very immediate call to action, act today, get online today, would actually benefit from being coloured by that attribute of timeliness in a hard news environment. If we step back one and look at what we've called the related news, news on how many people have downloaded the app, should I access my super, related to COVID, but nowhere near as confronting and as hard, we find here that we're looking at 2 strong attributes now, timely and trustworthy. And guys, this is where I think we might pause to draw your attention to the attribute of trustworthy. Now more than ever, as we hear fake news flying around everywhere, who can we trust? What do we trust? Premium content, that type of thing. I'll kind of leave the question over to you, but trustworthiness now and going forward is an incredibly powerful construct. Again, an advertiser in that environment of related news would have actually benefited from the association and the closer proximity to attributes like trustworthy and timely. And finally, if we look at the third category, which is lifestyle, probably the lightest news of all, the softest news. How do I grow veggies at home while I'm self-isolating? All that life in lockdown stuff that we even find a little humorous. We find that the 3 strongest attributes in this condition is timely, trustworthy again, and now we're looking at connected. So there's, I think, very, very interesting attribution. The other 3 have tended to weigh in at about average, so they may not influence the advertising, but the ones that are 130 plus and are strong, we're very confident would have some wash and colour over the advertising content itself. There's just an average of all 3 just to give you some sense of relativity. So if we're looking at an advertiser, a couple of advertisers in the lifestyle category, we've got Chemist Warehouse, eBay. You might note the Chemist Warehouse offer ends 1st of May. That would be a creative that's tapping into that attribute of timely. So, yes, it's an exposure, but not all exposures leave the same impression. Not all impressions leave the same impression. And this goes a long, long way to helping us understand that not all impacts are made the same and that you can stack the odds and shorten the odds in your favour, given what your creative strategy may be. So we've looked at a very important construct, which is the benefit or the growth of an attribute on an ad when you're associated with that environment. One last point that we'd like to draw your attention to, which is profoundly important. This goes a long way to explaining why advertising in a recession works both short, medium, and long term. And that is, if you grow a particular attribute in a media environment as an advertiser, you're more than likely weakening and suppressing your competition's attribute at the same time. So that tells us that there's a bit of a jungle up there. And whilst it may not be a purely zero-sum game, it's very, very likely that if you're strengthening, and when your advertising works and it all goes well and you're benefiting from the media environment, please appreciate that you're weakening and suppressing your competitors' same attribute. And this is all about, obviously, differentiation, making a difference, standing out, and colouring your message in the way that you want. If your competitor is absent, then you're also weakening their attribute as well. So before we hand over to Annie Parsons for her global perspectives, I'd like to basically summarise by saying that, you know, here are the elements that we see working when things go well and it all works in the way that we've just described. Your creative is distinctively yours. It, of course, therefore is well branded and appropriately branded. May not be at the end of a video, but it may be during a video. These are deceivingly simple, but deceivingly complex constructs. These are the ingredients. And clearly what we see now happening is there's a tangible link between the creative and media ecosystem working together, creative leveraging off the power of media. So please do consider them as an ecosystem now more than ever. If it's life beyond the cookie or whatever you're thinking, could this be a way to unlock an advantage? And of course, maintaining excess share of voice, as all the experts and the case studies have now recently highlighted, if you are taking advantage and doing it right, then you're well and truly benefiting from the competitive suppression that a media environment has to offer as well. So with that, I might hand over for the final run to Annie Parsons, and we'll join you at the end for Q&A. Annie.
Great, thank you, Peter. So I'm here for the industry perspective, and the privilege of a perspective is that I get to speak from a point of experience, knowledge, and opinion. Let me start with an opinion. I think that it is our collective role, and actually everyone who's listening here today, agencies, media owners, advertisers, and indeed, you know, industry bodies, that it's our responsibility to make our industry indispensable. And the only way that we're able to do that is to make sure that we maintain knowledge within our sector, to maintain learning and development. And so Neuro's work, and I know of Neuro through their work with QMS, is a huge step in pushing knowledge forward for our industry and the sector, because it's helping us understand something that we've not actually been able to quantify before, and that is how the medium can be an amplifier of the creative message. The work that Neuro has done actually scientifically now proves this as a fact. And here's why I think it's really fundamentally important, because this is proving, which is one of the system twos. It's that right side of the brain thinking, the creative intensity of what a communication means to us, which is in perfect balance to all of the brilliant work that's been done over the last 2 decades that's looked very much about machine, algorithms, the stuff of process and numbers. Now we need to look at the emotional side of that. And that's where we're at with this Neuro work. So we bring now science to the table, and it means we can take that step. If I just go one back, please, Mr. Peter, thank you, because we're now talking about the next step that we're all able to take, and it's the one where we use science to help our industry grow further in stature and reputation. Why? Because we can. Peter has just shown us that the science exists, and we can. Science generates data that can help us to use media better, make creative shine more, and that's got to help all of us and all of our businesses and brands. QMS actually made a significant investment and ongoing into Neuro, and this was purposely to help clients be able to use digital out of home better. Now, we're already working from a high base, so it wasn't about attracting advertisers to digital out of home, but it was helping them to use the medium better. And we wanted to add science into that perspective, because that's how we were going to push it along. That's how we were going to do what actually sounds a bit ironic, using science to champion creativity. But in doing that, we have data that improves the investment. So if you look at this slide now, we're talking about building on the proven old, but using some powerful new. The proven old is reach and frequency that we of the media industry have used for decades now, quite simply because it works. But within reach and frequency, we have actually always grappled with where creative fits into that. We know that reach and frequency matter, but actually they are both influenced by the power of creative. But we've never been able to really quantify that until we actually looked at working with Neuro and our digital out-of-home sites to look at what context meant in the equation. And what we found was that context was in fact a great adder to the way a communication is interpreted and understood. And that's critical to advertisers, because it's really providing some very scientific, substantiated evidence that their creative message can be enhanced through the media host. I wanted to actually make reference to the fact that when we did this work with QMS and Neuro, that the findings were such that we were able to, in fact, pen a white paper together, which is subsequently published in the World Advertising Research. And the reason that this matters particularly is because in decades past, every development about reach and frequency, which helped build our industry, was published in WARC. And now context as that third power has been the same. So we have three powers. And I think that that is a significant piece of new knowledge for our industry and the way to keep our industry vibrant. So reach, frequency, context. Let's actually have a look at the power of reach and context together. What I'm showing you now is, in fact, a great example of how reach and context together can be so powerful. This is very recent, incredibly current communication. Bravo to the Victorian government and the federal government, the messages which required big reach, so audience understanding the message as powerfully as possible, because effectively it was a life and death message. That is done very, very well. Now through Neuro, advertisers are actually able to see sites not just by the reach that they can deliver, but by the attribute as well, so that this can help amplify their creative message. It's not just a filter, but it's a scientific lens. So what we're effectively doing is adding greater science to digital out of home when we've used Neuro. And doing that, we actually started off with 20 sites, now rolled out to many more across the country, and 12 attributes, which of course can also be expanded. But this was our view about how to look at digital out of home beyond the traditional view of a static site. Let's give advertisers the opportunity to understand more than just the reach and frequency. It actually then allows a completely different and a much richer conversation to be able to happen with advertisers and agencies. And importantly, it brings creative very much into the conversation from the out. And that is so important, because I think we all still sometimes wonder about getting creative even better for out-of-home exposure. This is another way to do it. And going back to my first point about our responsibility, we are actually not only moving forward in terms of understanding a digital world from a static world, but we're moving the media framework forward by putting science around that third power of context. The power of context is what we can see in this example from one of our sites, the roaring roads of Rozelle. From those attributes that were applied for that site, we saw what actually fitted into that very strong area that Peter spoke of, where if we're talking about anything which is 130 or more, we're talking about something which really does have an impact on the creative which appears on that site. So modern was something that was very, very strong at this site in Rozelle. So you can imagine that for a brand like eBay or Apple, where modern can push their brand perception, having that amplification from the site transferred to the creative is materially valuable. And with now the science behind this in neuro, we can apply numbers to that. Let's have a look at a real life brain journey, if you will, when consumers were exposed to this site in Punt Road. Now, this is a map of what's going on in the brain, and it is the memory encoding, the thing that needs to happen to get into long-term memory. But it's the journey that Peter was describing earlier in his example. This is a site, Punt Road in Richmond. Here in Paris, we always say that all journeys lead to Punt Road. Yeah, that's what we say in Paris. But this is a site that QMS knew to be exceptional for reach and frequency, but was wanted to be identified beyond those two dimensions to bring in that third power of context. And again, understanding the right brain impact. So this monitoring of brain activity, just as Peter highlighted, shows the ad in context, which is responsible for that shift in the brand attribute, what is very clearly highlighted there in the pink box. And again, as Peter explained, the two lines separating is in fact telling us that the creative attribute is occurring at that very moment. And what was that attribute that we're seeing happen there on Punt Road? Well, actually, the one that was the knockout was all about famous. And so imagine in a really competitive sector, and actually always in advertising, what isn't a really competitive sector? But let's imagine it's retail, which, you know, is an incredibly relentless competitive market of multiple brands and offerings. We know through neuroscience that this site has high strength in its association with famous. And actually what would happen is that a brand advertising in this site is going to have a greater uplift in its dimension against famous than it would when not being in situ on that site. So its very location on that site is what makes it more powerful when it's expressing that attribute of famous. An established brand like Maya on this site is actually able to be instantly and intrinsically associated with fame. How brilliant to be able to do that when they're fighting tooth and nail to get every little bit of awareness and impact for what they're saying. This and that location is going to help them there enormously. That is a material difference that has to be something that agencies and advertisers would want to consider. The media and the message, when they come together and in sync, do get taken very seriously. And when that happens well, action ultimately follows. So there you have the complete desired marketing journey happen, because you have media and message, you have reach and context working brilliantly. In this example here, we're looking at bustling Brisbane. This is back in December, and a campaign with Go Compare, where they were promoting their Simples Fuel app. Their objective was just to maximise reach. Well, a big tick, because they're getting tens of thousands. But actually, the thing that is making the difference here and actually resulted in a 38% increase in app downloads was that the context was exactly right, to the point where we've got an example here, and Peter and I were talking about this earlier today, that actually it was yesterday, that you've got reach and context, and when you've got those two powers happening, it actually makes frequency perhaps the third thing that needs to be considered. And with reach and context happening well, your frequency can potentially be dialed down. So this is a real statement then about investment and where an advertiser's investment can go. If you can make that kind of difference and impact your investment so specifically and precisely, it's something that advertisers really need to take notice of. Therefore, it's actually, in fact, a business case for advertising. Advertising works always. It's only the degrees which are ever in question. Advertising is a powerful research when it's done well. And this recovery phase, and indeed the inevitable recession, can be shorter and easier because of advertising. Now, by bringing science to the table, we've actually got the data to inform decisions better and generate more impact. And we have just seen how creative, good and the very best of creative can have additional impact by virtue of the transfer of equity from the site, the host media, and that creative message. Well, I think that, this is why we're going to see smart marketers like Chemist Warehouse want to take advantage in this recession, from this point of recovery, to be out there telling that story and taking advantage of every known ability to get their communications stronger and better. It seems to me that risk and uncertainty in marketing are the weapons of mass destruction, actually. Action with some risk is certainly better than uncertainty and doing nothing, because that's, in fact, the sure way to hurt your business and your brand. But the best option has to be action with no risk and a certainty of outcome. And using context as the third power, along with reach and frequency, really does make that possible. I think it's important that we, again, in thinking about how to keep this sector, this industry indispensable, we need to think about science and creativity, and it is always about a perspective on driving the return on investment. We have got the expertise to impart the experts that are going to apply their science to give us the data that in turn we can share with you, the advertisers and the agencies, that gives you a better understanding of how a medium works. And I think that's exactly what the IAB have tried to do here with Neuro, in understanding what's happening in news, in premium sites online. But understanding how that medium works in the heads of your consumer, from the perspective of the emotional intensity of what they're getting out of the message and how that impacts with your creative. Those two things, previously just our thoughts or our assumptions, are now actually known facts. They are not assumptions anymore, they're real numbers. So use them, because we want advertisers to make your best informed decisions. And without doubt, using this third power of context, we have science that fuels creativity and that is capable of delivering better return on investment. That's the step forward that we all should want to take. I think I would now like to hand back to Gai to check with what questions we might have.
Fantastic. Thanks, Annie. Great call to arms for all of us. I think we need to keep sight of that sort of bigger picture and future state that we will all come to. So we'll have some time for questions. Some have already come through, but feel free to pop them in the Q&A box, and we'll try and get through as many as we can. But any of the questions that are coming through around technology, we will talk to. But Pete, if you wouldn't mind just flicking to the next screen for a sec. A few weeks ago, we actually did a Q&A series with a lot of our tech vendors when we came out with our statements around backing and not blocking news, and some really good practical ways that you can add nuance for your brands in terms of brand safety, particularly in news environments. So Tiff's going to add that link into the chat area if you want to have a look at it, but some really practical advice on how to manage a lot of these insights that we've come through with today. Maybe click back, Pete. So this presentation, before we get into Q&A, just a couple of other bits. We will have the report up on the IAB website next Monday, and we're also recording this webinar, and we'll distribute the link to everyone who registered. So you can watch again or share with friends and family. All right, so a few questions coming through. I think, well, before I get to that, actually, one more thing. I'd like to thank Pete for jumping on this project, because he really did see our release around backing and not blocking news. And I don't think there's anyone in the industry or out of the industry who wouldn't think that backing journalism and media environments at the moment is, not a good thing and an important thing, particularly after with COVID and bushfires in Australia. We've had a very big news year. But giving advertisers evidence that it's not just the right thing to do, it's the right thing to do for their brand as well, is an important, role of the IAB to make sure that people have the evidence that it works, as well as that it feels right. So thanks, Pete, for jumping on that so quickly. I don't think I've ever had research out so quickly, which is fantastic. All right, so a few questions coming through, but first, Pete, I'm going to ask you one thing around audiences. and I haven't prepared you for this, so you might not know the answer.
Okay.
But we looked at brands that had fairly frequent visitors to news sites. So there's certain assets that those regular audiences associate with that brand. So if they're in a particular news brand, they associate it with, feelings that are connected with themselves. Is that different for very loyal audiences to very light audiences? Would it be?
Yeah, you're right, Gai. You haven't prepped me on that one. Yeah, look, it's actually when we do talk about media measurement, the issue of looking at the different stratification of audiences is pretty common. Like, as you say, a light viewer versus a loyal viewer, for example. I'm just trying to think back to the last time we did something like that. And look, there is certainly a structural difference between a loyal fan of a TV program or an online environment versus a casual or a light viewer or a light browser, if you like. So, yep, there's certainly that really does stack the odds very, very differently from a brain response. I guess drawing it back to today's discussion, I'd have to say that if a site or a media property had a certain fabric, then that fabric could be the very essence of why people come back and enjoy it and consume it, because they're, if I'm just trying to think back to trustworthy, connected, timely, they're probably the ingredients that make that audience stickier as well. Because there's certainly, that's the association that's going on. So that would be the underpinning, I would say. Like, from a neuro point of view, yes, we've always seen that a loyal is different to a casual. I would say it's exactly the same thing when you look at the implicit kind of makeup and fabric. Yeah, and that would, of course, therefore, as we've said today, have a strong influence on advertisers in that environment as well. And I guess a long-term advertiser, say a sponsor, would be hardwiring that every time that exposure took place. Yeah. Right. Actually, just one other comment while I think of it, Gai, and I know this wasn't on the agenda as well, but most of the data we've looked at today is really just after one exposure. And I know Annie talked about, the whole issue of frequency. So I guess the question is, imagine what would happen over a campaign, or what would happen over a long period of time, when you're consistently reinforcing, and if you're not building, you're strengthening those associations. So,
and I guess we know too that campaigns work best when they're in different channels as well. So you're getting different attributes from different environments adding into that campaign as well.
Absolutely, yeah. We've really only looked at a one-dimensional online news environment, as you know. But yeah, there's a bigger ecosystem at play, isn't there? And how they link. And look, the potential is that they could be linked on attributes as well, whether they're the same attribute or you have a cluster of attributes that you want to surround your message and your brand.
All right, we better get through a few more questions. There's one that probably I can help answer, and Annie might be able to give a perspective as well, particularly with the growth of digital out of home. So a question around post-cookie, if context will become the key buying factor. From my point of view, obviously, context is going to become more important, or as important as it probably should have always been. But it doesn't mean that we're going to lose the benefit of a lot of the factors that have driven, engagement and understanding of audiences. So data will still come into play. There'll be a range of first-party data. There'll be other sort of, ways from a technology point of view of ensuring that those buying decisions have other attributes as well. But context is, as we've seen with creative and context, probably the two superpowers that have been underplayed in the recent years. And I don't
I think that's right, Gai, that it's not that we haven't always had interesting discussions, sometimes debates about is it content that's king? It used to be, where does channel fit into all of this? And I think where we are at now in the 21st century, happy days, is that we've understood that context is actually one of the pivotal players in the mix of things to consider, because that does, by nature of what it's talking about, put full perspective and power on the communication itself, on the creative message. So it actually makes us really think about the creative message and where it's appearing and what that amalgamation of those two things are going to do. So I don't think it becomes the key element, but I think we're making sure that it is right up there as one of the elements. And if due consideration is given to that, it actually does have real impact on how a campaign is interpreted by the consumer.
Right. A question through from Jamie from the BBC. Given many brand attributes are in the eye of the beholder, both from an audience and a media owner perspective, how can advertisers best identify the right context for their ads to drive effectiveness of brand outcomes for campaigns? I'll just quickly start with this because I think it was an important part of the research design that we set up with Pete. We looked at two very different news brands that, you know, from an individual person would see very different attributes coming through, but we looked at the audiences that were, as we said, loyal to these brands. So, you know, some of those attributes will be common across news brands, even though an individual person may see different things in different brands, if that makes sense. Pete, you might want to dig me out of that hole.
Oh, yeah, no. I guess an extension of that, yes. It depends on a few ingredients. Yes, the environment we're looking at, the nature of the audience or the browser, as in loyal through to casual. But yeah, I think what we set out to do here is to get a representative mix of loyal online news browsers. So that was the sample construct, and then it was a question of the actual environment itself. So I guess to large part, it in terms of the eye of the beholder, it's a good point, but it's certainly built on more than sufficient, I guess, sample size, meaning that it is, as best as we know, quite representative of what's going on out there in the real world. So they're real people with real, you know, with a real definition around what they do for their news diet, I suppose. So that would be my take. And then just like any sample data.
Is it not also important to consider that what your data is able to do is tell us what is really going on, as opposed to sometimes the eye of the beholder is what we think, you know, there are other influences, there are other biases that are coming out and what we might just say, as opposed to what is actually going on in that right-hand side of the brain and how we're emotionally connecting and reacting to something.
Yes, Annie. Yeah, that sort of that construct in terms of why would you use neuro anyhow is we believe in all seriousness a massive part of this puzzle, and that is that sure, I can ask someone to give me a list of 10 attributes, but are they really the real attributes? So we would stand behind the science to say that some things you know, you just can't articulate, and it's like trying to guess your cholesterol. Why would you try and guess it when you can just measure it? So yeah. What we're saying is measure your cholesterol and no.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Yeah. One more question then. Unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap up, but if more questions come through, we'll find a way of answering them and publish them on the IAB website. I guess one question that takes our premise as far as it can go. So are we trying to say that there are no brand safety risks within news environments for advertisers? I might again start with this one and then hand over to you two. Tiff actually just put up a link to a interview that the IAB did with a couple of different people last week, including Unilever's media director, Jennifer, and I'm going to forget her name, Jennifer Gardner. And she, if you listen to that, she gives a really good advertiser view of how they've approached this. They basically, at the beginning of COVID, pulled everything off and then slowly came to come back on as they understood the risk of not being there and the missed opportunities, and really looking at the context for their individual brands. So for looking at historic data that they did in terms of, really hardcore environmental coverage being appropriate to a lot of their brands that are talking about environmentally sensitive issues, but then also, and I forget which of their brands, it talks about courage, but within hard news environments, that link between their brand value of courage and news reporting at this time was seen as really powerful. So recommend anyone go and have a listen to that as well, and how that nuance can come into play. So we're not saying go willy-nilly, and obviously there will be times and certain topics for certain advertisers that are wrong, but not going overboard and blocking these whole environments. You're going to miss engaged, loyal audiences, and as we're shown today, that lift that those environments can give your brand and its creative at the same time.
Yeah, I might maybe complement that, Gabe. I guess my sentiment would be it's so frustrating to see this debate run wild out there, with actually what we see is very little data to inform the debate. Now, I don't think we're saying for a second is that this webinar is going to completely fix COVID-related anxiety, but our frustration came from a point of, well, okay, so where's the evidence to help actually manage the debate? So it's about balance, and actually, to your point, you'd have to argue there's a greater risk in not doing anything than there is in actually sort of getting out there, as Annie was saying, getting out there with all the evidence and all the data and all the right decision-making tools you can bring to bear to make sure that you actually de-risk that investment. Yes, and you tune your creative appropriately. You may choose to do that as well. So yeah, I honestly think there's a greater risk in actually just going dark than there is than trying to manage your way into an appropriate way to contextually say what you want to say. Yeah, and as it turns out, there actually is, there are strong attributes that could actually propel your message, even in a hard environment. So it's up to the individual brand and, to make those decisions. At least we're saying we've got a little bit more evidence that was previously invisible to help guide that process.
Brilliant.
Yeah, but within evidence, it's how you it's how you de-risk, which is obviously part of why they've come back and said they're risking too much value by not being active at this point. Absolutely. And sometimes I think that brand safety risk is as simple as not accounting for those three powers between reach, context and frequency. Sometimes it's too much frequency, which is actually the brand safety risk, as opposed to being active in the first place. It's just how you play with each of those dimensions.
Totally agree. Thank you both. We're over time, but it's been a pleasure.